Voss Station was one of the biggest places in the known galaxy, a giant spinning ring of steel, glass, and light that hung silently above a pale blue planet in the deep neutral zone. Thousands of beings from dozens of different worlds walked through its wide corridors every single day. Traders carrying heavy crates, soldiers on leave, diplomats in long robes, scientists with data pads, and families just trying to get from one place to another. The station never slept. Its lights never fully went dark and its corridors never fully went quiet. Somewhere on Voss Station, there was always movement, always noise, and always the smell of 100 different foods being cooked in 100 different ways. Humans had been coming to Voss Station for about 30 years, not a long time by galactic standards. Most of the older species who ran the Galactic Cooperative had been traveling the stars for thousands of years before humans ever left their own solar system. Because of this, humans were not treated as equals. They were tolerated, mostly, allowed into the station, allowed to trade, and allowed to send diplomats, but always looked at sideways, always spoken to like they were a little slow, always reminded in small and quiet ways that they were the new ones, the young ones, the ones who still had a lot to learn. Most humans had gotten used to this. They kept their heads down, did their work, and then moved through the galaxy without making too much noise, but they remembered everything. Dr. Amara Osei was a xenobiologist. She studied alien life for a living, and she was very good at it. She had spent the last 6 years working with a human diplomatic convoy that traveled between stations and planets, building relationships with other species, exchanging knowledge, trying to make the galaxy a little friendlier for humanity. She was patient, warm, and very careful with her words. Her daughter Maya was 9 years old. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's loud laugh. She wore a bright orange jacket that was a little too big for her, and she kept her hair in 2 round puffs on the sides of her head. She had never been afraid of anything in her short life, and Voss Station fascinated her completely. On the day everything changed, Maya and her mother were walking through Transit Corridor 7, one of the busiest hallways on the entire station. Beings of all shapes and sizes moved in every direction. Some were tall and thin, some were short and wide, some moved on 4 legs, some floated slightly above the floor. Maya watched all of them with huge and curious eyes, turning her head left and right as they walked. Commander Dreth Vol was coming the other way. He was a Skarn, tall, broad, covered in pale gray plated skin that looked almost like natural armor. His actual armor was dark red with gold markings that showed his rank and his family line. He was a senior military officer of the Skarn Imperium. In one of the most powerful political forces in the Galactic Cooperative, 4 Skarn soldiers walked behind him in a tight and perfect formation. People moved out of his way without being asked. They always did. It was simply what happened when Vol walked through a room. Vol was not watching where he was going. Why would he? He never needed to. The galaxy moved for him. Maya was looking up at a group of Flothari traders who were arguing loudly near a food stall, their feathered arms waved in the air and their voices layered over each other in bright cascading tones. She was smiling at them. She was not looking forward. She turned back around just in time to walk directly into Commander Vol's path. She bumped into his leg. It was nothing. The kind of small accident that happened 100 times a day in a crowded corridor. She barely felt it. She looked up at the enormous gray figure looming above her and opened her mouth to say, "Sorry." Vol looked down at her, the way someone looks at something they have accidentally stepped on. He did not pause, did not think, and did not consider anything at all. He swung his arm. The back of his armored gauntlet hit Maya across the face with full force. The sound was sharp and horrible, the kind of sound that cut straight through every other noise in the corridor and made every being nearby freeze in place. Maya's small body flew sideways and hit the far wall hard. She slid down to the floor, her orange jacket bunched up around her shoulders. Blood appeared on her cheek immediately. and bright red against her brown skin, and her eyes went wide with shock and pain. The corridor went completely silent. Voss straightened his uniform jacket with both hands. Behind him, his 4 soldiers stood still with blank faces. Around them, that beings from dozens of worlds stood frozen and stared. A Theresi merchant looked away. A Glenish diplomat suddenly found something very important to read on his data pad. A group of young Flothari students stared hard at the floor tiles. No one stepped forward. No one said a word. Striking a child of a lower registered species was not technically illegal under Skarn diplomatic law. The Skarn Imperium had negotiated that protection into the Cooperative Accord a very long time ago. Back when the Cooperative was young and desperate for Skarn support, no one had ever seriously tried to change it. Dr. Amara reached her daughter in 3 steps. She dropped to her knees and pulled Maya tightly against her chest. Maya made a small and pained sound. She did not cry. She pressed her face hard into her mother's shoulder and breathed in fast. Shallow pulls. Amara's hands were shaking, but her face was still. 3 humans stood nearby in the crowd. Sergeant Cole Harker was off duty. He had been eating something from a folded paper bag and watching the crowd pass with the relaxed attention of someone with nowhere important to be. He was a big man with short, dark hair and a face that showed very little. When the blow landed, the paper bag stopped moving in his hand. His eyes went to Maya first, then slowly moved to Vol, and then to the 4 soldiers, and then back to Vol. His face did not change. Elena Voss worked freight on the station's lower docks. She had strong hands, a practical mind. And in 3 years of knowing every corner of this station, she had been walking to her next shift when she heard the sound. She stopped walking and stood very still with her arms at her sides and her eyes fixed on the scene in front of her. Dr. Yusuf Amir was a trauma surgeon. He had been on his way to the medical bay when the crowd suddenly stopped moving. He had seen terrible things in his career and had developed the kind of face that did not give much away. But his jaw tightened when he saw the blood spreading across Maya's cheek, and his eyes moved with the quick professional assessment of a man who spent his life measuring damage. Commander Vol did not look back. He walked away down the corridor with his 4 soldiers close behind him, and his heavy boots made a steady rhythmic sound on the metal floor. One of his soldiers said something low in Skarn, and the others laughed quietly among themselves. The crowd slowly began to move again. Conversations restarted. Their footsteps resumed. The station noise returned like water filling back into a space. Cole watched Vol until the gray, armored figure turned a corner and disappeared from sight. Then he folded the top of his paper bag shut, tucked it under his arm, and walked slowly across the corridor toward Elena and Yusuf. He did not hurry. There was no reason to hurry right now. He looked at Elena. She gave one small nod. He looked at Yusuf. Yusuf held his gaze for a moment. She glanced once at Maya, still pressed against her mother on the floor, and then gave one small nod. Cole said nothing. He simply turned and walked away in a different direction entirely. Corridor 7 filled back up with noise and movement and the ordinary business of the galaxy, but 3 humans had seen everything, and humans more than almost any other species in the known galaxy, and had very long and very precise memories. The human quarters on Voss Station were not the nicest part of the station. They were practical, clean, and small. The walls were plain gray metal, the ceilings were low, and the lights had a slightly warm yellow tint that most humans found familiar and most other species found unpleasant. Humans had a way of making any space feel lived in very quickly. There were boots by doors, jackets hung on chairs, mugs sitting on surfaces, and then the constant quiet sound of people talking somewhere just out of sight. Dr. Amara sat on the edge of a narrow medical cot in the small clinic attached to the human residential block. Maya lay beside her with a white bandage fixed carefully to her left cheek. The cut had not been deep, but the bruising was dark and wide and spread from her cheekbone almost to her jaw. The medic on duty, a young man named Torres, Ike had cleaned the wound carefully and said that Maya would be completely fine. Maya was already asking when she could go see the observation deck again. Amara told her soon. She kept her voice steady and her face calm. She was very good at keeping her face calm. After Maya fell asleep, Amara walked to the station's official complaint terminal at the end of the corridor and filled out a full incident report. She wrote everything she had seen, the exact time, the exact location, the full name of Commander Voss, the rank markings and unit insignia on his soldier's armor, and a precise and detailed description of what had happened in Corridor 7. She attached her diplomatic credentials to the submission and sent it through the official channel. The response came back in 53 minutes. The station authority regretted to inform her that Commander Voss of the Skarn Imperium held full diplomatic immunity under Article 14 of the Cooperative Skarn Accord. No action could be taken at this time. The complaint had been formally filed and recorded in the system. She was thanked for her time and encouraged to have a pleasant stay on Voss Station. Amara read the message once. Then she closed the terminal and walked back to sit beside her sleeping daughter. She did not look surprised. On the other side of the residential block, in a narrow break room with one table, 3 chairs, and a coffee machine that worked about half the time, Cole Harker sat across from Elena Voss and Yusuf Amir. There was no coffee on the table, no food, just 3 humans in a small room with the door closed and the ventilation humming softly above them. Cole spoke first. He spoke quietly and without any heat in his voice. He described exactly what he had seen in Corridor 7 in the order that it happened. He used clean and precise language and did not add anything extra or dramatic. Elena and Yusuf listened without interrupting. When he finished, Elena said that she had seen it too. Every detail she described matched Cole's exactly. Yusuf said the same. 3 accounts, 1 event, all lining up. Then the room was quiet for a moment. Cole asked if either of them had a problem with what he was about to do next. He did not explain what that was. He did not need to. Elena looked at him steadily and shook her head. Yusuf looked at the table for 3 full seconds, then looked back up and shook his head. Cole stood up and left the room and walked 2 levels down to a storage corridor where a private communications terminal was built into the wall behind a maintenance panel. The terminal was military encrypted, designed for operational use. Ian required a 16-character code that Cole entered from memory. He had not used this terminal in over 2 years, but he had never let himself forget the code. He typed a message to Human Reach Command, the central military and diplomatic authority governing humanity's presence in the wider galaxy. The message was short and direct. It named Commander Voss, described the incident with precision, confirmed that a formal complaint had been submitted and dismissed within the hour, and ended with a single clean request, authorization for a quiet resolution. He sent it and leaned against the wall and waited. The response came back in 11 minutes. It said, "Authorized, keep it clean." Cole deleted both messages from the terminal's memory, closed the panel, and walked back to the break room. He sat down across from Elena and Yusuf and looked at them both. He said 2 words, "We're clear." Elena nodded and stood. She said she needed to pull up the service corridor maps for the diplomatic wing before her shift started, and that she would have what they needed within the hour. She left without looking back. Yusuf stood, rolled his sleeves to his elbows. Ian said quietly that he needed to check something in the medical supply room. He would be ready when Cole needed him. He left. Cole sat alone in the break room for a few minutes. He was not angry. Anger was a loud and unsteady thing, and loud, unsteady things were not useful right now. What he felt was quieter than anger and much more focused. It sat in the center of his chest like a still weight, and it pointed in one direction only. It was the kind of feeling that did not need a name, because it already knew exactly what it was going to do. On the upper administrative level of Voss Station, The counselor Yeen of the Flothari species sat in her private office and watched the security footage she had requested from Corridor 7. She watched it once all the way through without moving. Then she watched it again. She sat back in her wide chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time. Yeen was 112 years old. She had been a working diplomat for 80 of those years. She had seen a great many things in that time. She had watched species rise to dominance and slowly fall apart. She had watched alliances form over shared interests and collapse over old wounds. She had seen wars begin over things that seemed impossibly small, and she had seen peace arrive from directions no one expected. She had been present in this very station when humanity first sent a delegation to the Galactic Cooperative, and she had been watching humans carefully ever since. Most species underestimated humans. They looked at the short history, the young civilization, and the emotional faces and the loud voices, and they decided they were looking at something simple. Yeen had never made that mistake. She had spoken with human diplomats, human soldiers, human scientists, and human dock workers. She had eaten meals with them and argued policy with them, and once, memorably, she'd been caught in a failing atmospheric seal with 3 human engineers who had fixed the problem using parts from their own equipment and a great deal of calm and creative thinking. The one thing she had noticed, the thing that other species always seemed to miss, it was that humans were patient in a way that went very deep. They would absorb a tremendous amount. They would wait and think and say very little. They would let the formal process run its course, even when they already knew how it was going to end. And then, when all of that was done, they would act, and when humans acted, they did not act halfway. She had seen the 3 humans standing in Corridor 7 on the footage. She had watched their faces very carefully. She had seen Cole Harker fold his paper bag shut. She pressed the call button on her desk, and when her senior aide answered, she told him to prepare a formal statement. She did not tell him yet what it would say, because she did not know all the details yet. But she told him it would need to be ready within 24 hours. He asked what the statement was regarding. She considered the question for a moment. Then she said, "I believe we will know by morning. Just have it ready." He left to begin preparing it. Yeen turned back to the security footage and watched one more time. The corridor, the crowd, the small girl in the orange jacket, the armored hand, at the wall. She watched Cole Harker fold his paper bag with the same unhurried motion a man might use to set down a book he had finished reading. She felt something she had not felt in a long time. Not quite fear, because fear was about uncertainty. And this was not uncertain at all. It was more like the feeling of standing at the edge of something very high and understanding with great and complete clarity exactly how far down the ground was. She turned off the screen. She began to prepare. The service tunnels of Voss Station were not built for comfort. They were narrow, low corridors that ran behind the walls and beneath the floors of the main halls like a hidden skeleton. They smelled of machine oil, recycled air, hot and warm metal. Maintenance drones moved through them on small, quiet wheels, and the deep hum of the station's engines was always present. So a low and constant vibration that you felt more in your chest than heard with your ears. Most beings who worked on Voss Station had never been inside the service tunnels. Most beings had no reason to go there. Elena Voss had spent 3 years working the freight docks of the station's lower levels. She knew the service tunnel network the way she knew her own quarters. Every major route, every junction point, every access hatch, every door that was logged by the system and every door that was not. She had learned it the slow way, walking the routes during quiet hours. Building the map in her head over months and years. It was not something she had planned to ever use for anything like this. She had simply never been the kind of person who threw away useful knowledge. Cole Harker had spent 12 years in the Human Reach military, 6 of those years in small unit operations conducted in environments that most other species in the galaxy would have found completely impossible to survive in. He had operated in hard vacuum, as in deep jungle with no air support, in mountain ranges so cold that most equipment stopped working, and in dense city environments where every surface could be a threat. He was not the largest or the fastest person on Voss station. He was not even the largest or fastest human. But he moved with a quiet and complete confidence that came from having been in very bad places many times. I'd come out of all of them. Dr. Yusuf Amir had never been a soldier. But he had worked in field hospitals on 3 different planets, in conditions that had no clean supply lines and no backup, and he had seen things that would have broken most people into pieces. He had very steady hands and a mind that worked with unusual clarity under pressure. He had also, in the years before medical school, spent 4 years doing something that did not appear on his official employment record, and in a part of Earth's northern continent that was not on most civilian maps. He never talked about those years in professional settings, but he had not forgotten them either. The 3 of them entered the service tunnels at separate access points at 2200 hours, station time. Voll's 4 soldiers were the first consideration. They were stationed in rotating pairs along the outer corridor of the diplomatic wing, and covering the 2 approaches to the commander's private quarters. They were Scaran military, trained and armed and alert, but they were alert in the way soldiers are alert when they believe they are safe. They were watching for threats that matched their understanding of what a threat looked like, something large and obvious and loud. They were not prepared for what came instead. Elena found the first pair. She was wearing a standard maintenance uniform she had borrowed from the freight dock supply room. She was carrying a repair kit in one hand and a work order displayed on the data pad in the other. She knocked on the utility access door beside the guard post and told them in a flat, tired voice that there was a pressure valve fault in the atmospheric system behind that wall section. It had been flagged by the monitoring system 20 minutes ago. If it was not fixed before the end of the shift, Section D would start losing atmospheric pressure by morning. The guards looked at her data pad. They looked at her maintenance badge. They looked at her face, which had the patient and mildly irritated expression of someone who had been fixing this station's problems for 3 years and had no interest in anything in the world except the pressure valve. One guard stayed at the post. The other moved to open the utility panel in the wall. Cole came down through the ceiling access hatch directly above the guard at the post. What happened next was fast and quiet. The guard was large and armored and strong, and he reacted with real speed. He hit Cole twice in the first 3 seconds. The first blow landed on Cole's shoulder, and the second caught the side of his head. Cole did not slow down. Humans had come from a planet that spent 4 billion years building things that could survive being hit, and Cole was a product of that world in every sense. His skeleton absorbed what it needed to absorb, that his body flooded with the kind of chemical response that his species had been using to push through pain since long before civilization. The guard hit him twice, and Cole did not stop, and 30 seconds later both guards were on the floor, breathing steadily, and Cole was checking his shoulder with 2 fingers and deciding it was not serious. Yusuf handled the second pair on the opposite approach corridor. He came to them from the medical wing direction, moving quickly, telling them that the commander's quarters had sent a distress signal to the medical system 4 minutes ago. He needed to check the commander's condition immediately. His voice had the specific authority of someone who dealt with emergencies for a living and expected other people to get out of the way. While the first guard was turning to check the quarters door, Yusuf applied, with precise and practiced hands, the technique that shut down the body's ability to stay conscious in about 4 seconds. The second guard moved, and Yusuf was faster. Both guards were on the floor before either of them understood what had happened. None of it was elegant. None of it was anything like the action sequences in the entertainment programs that other species sometimes produced about human soldiers. It was simply effective, the way a well-planned medical procedure is effective. Precise, prepared, and completed without unnecessary movement. Voss was alone in his private quarters when the door opened. He was sitting at a small table reviewing trade documents on a flat screen. Beside his hand was a wide glass with something amber in it. He had not thought once about the girl in Corridor 7 since leaving that afternoon. She had ceased to exist the moment he walked away. Beings like her did not occupy his mind. He looked up and saw Cole Harker standing in the doorway. For just a moment, his face showed something that almost never appeared on a Scarn officer's face, genuine and complete surprise. It was there and gone in less than a second, and then his training took over and his hand moved toward the personal sidearm lying on the table beside his glass. Cole did not move. He stood in the doorway and watched Voss's hand close around the weapon and lift it. And the expression on Cole's face as the weapon came up was the thing that Voss, in the final seconds of his life, could not find a name for in any language he knew. It was not anger. Anger came with heat and noise and the need to be seen. It was not hatred. Hatred was personal and hungry. It was something much simpler and much older. It was the absolute and total certainty of a being who had already decided hours ago exactly how this was going to end, and had simply been walking toward that ending ever since. The story did not follow Cole through the next few minutes. It moved instead to Counselor Yeen's office on the administrative level, where she sat at her desk in the deep quiet of late station night with a cup of tea going cold beside her hand. Her communication terminal chimed once. She opened the channel. The message was short, sent from an encrypted human communications address, and it said only, "The matter has been resolved. A formal delivery will be made to the council at 800 hours." Yeen set down her cup. She sat completely still for a long moment. Then she pressed the call button on her desk, and when her night duty aide answered his voice thick with sleep, she said with perfect calm, "I need the Grand Assembly Hall opened for a full council session at 800. I need every delegation contacted tonight. I need them all there," her aide asked carefully. "If everything was all right." "Not entirely," she said, "but it will be handled correctly. Wake them all up if you need to." She closed the channel and looked out the small viewport beside her desk. The dark space beyond the station's outer ring was full of quiet stars, and the pale planet below turned slowly in the dark as it always had, as it always would, entirely indifferent to the things that happened on the small bright ring above it. Yeen thought about a 9-year-old girl in an orange jacket. She thought about blood on a brown cheek. She thought about a man folding a paper bag with unhurried hands. And she thought that the galaxy had perhaps been long overdue for a lesson it had been quietly refusing to learn. She began to write her statement. The Grand Assembly Hall of the Galactic Cooperative Council was the most formal room on Voss Station, a wide circular chamber with high curved walls and tiered rows of seating that rose around a central open floor like a bowl. The seats were built for many different bodies, with different shapes and heights and surface materials to accommodate the enormous variety of species that held seats in the cooperative. From above, the filled chamber looked like an impossible garden, all different colors and textures and sizes pressed together under the white overhead lights. At 0752 hours, every seat was taken. Word had moved through the station the night before in the quiet and unstoppable way that important information always moves, through whispered conversations in corridors, through encrypted side channels between delegation staffers, through the simple shared instinct that all living beings carry, and the feeling that something in the air has shifted and that whatever comes next will matter. Delegations had been woken from sleep and told to be present. Most of them had come without asking too many questions, because Counselor Yeen did not call emergency sessions casually, and everyone who had worked in cooperative politics for more than a year knew that. The Scarn delegation sat in their usual block in the upper right section of the chamber. 7 of them, and in formal gray and gold. Their posture was correct and their faces were composed, but they had not been able to reach Commander Voss since the previous evening. and the 4 soldiers assigned to his quarters had been found unconscious in a service corridor by a maintenance drone at 0340 hours. The soldiers were alive and physically unharmed, and none of them could provide a complete account of what had happened to them. There was a tight and controlled tension behind the Skarn delegation's eyes that they were working very hard not to show. Counselor Yeen sat in the central mediator's chair. The chair was elevated slightly above the presentation. The floor and faced the full sweep of the tiered seating. She had sat in this chair for hundreds of sessions over many years. She had used it to manage arguments between species who shared no words and no biology and no common understanding of what basic courtesy even meant. Today, she sat with her hands folded on the desk in front of her, her face entirely calm, and waited. At exactly 800 hours, the main entrance doors at the base of the chamber opened. Sergeant Cole Harker walked in. He wore the full-dress uniform of the Human Reach military, dark gray fabric with a single clean stripe of blue running across the left shoulder. The uniform was pressed and correct in every detail. He carried no weapons. His boots were quiet on the smooth floor, and his pace was steady and even. He walked to the presentation dais at the center of the room, without looking at the rows of watching, faces above him. Behind him, Elena Voss and Yusuf Amir walked in civilian clothes. Elena wore dark practical clothing with her hands loose at her sides. Yusuf walked with his hands behind his back and his eyes straight forward. They took positions 2 steps behind Cole and stopped. Cole set a sealed diplomatic container on the presentation dais. It was the standard black container used for official evidence submissions to the council, flat-sided with a security seal panel across the top. He entered a short code on the panel. The seal made a soft click and released. The chamber was completely and absolutely silent. Cole opened the container. Inside, preserved with the same careful and clinical formality as any official diplomatic submission, he was the head of Commander Dreth Vol. Attached to the interior wall of the container was a standard evidence data chip in a clear sleeve. On the chip was the full sensor footage from Corridor 7, time-stamped and authenticated, along with the official complaint submitted by Dr. Amara Osei, the response from the station authority declining to act, and the complete chain of communications that had followed. Every delegation in the chamber could see into the container from their seats. No one made a sound. Cole looked up at the council rows. When he spoke, his voice was clear and level and carried easily through the silent chamber. There was no raised tone, no drama. I'd no performance in it. A Skarn Imperial officer struck a human child on this station, he said. Your legal process was contacted and declined to act. Ours did not. We will always act. We ask that the council note this for future reference. He stepped back 1 pace from the dais and was still. For a moment, the entire chamber held itself suspended. 47 delegations, hundreds of beings, all of them not moving, not speaking, yet sitting with what they had just seen and what they had just heard. Then Ambassador Vor of the Skarn delegation came to his feet. Vor was old and had been in cooperative politics for a very long time, and he was well known for having a voice that could fill large spaces without effort. He used that voice now. He called it an assassination. He called it an act of war against the Skarn Imperium. He called for the immediate arrest and detention of all 3 humans present in the chamber. He called for emergency sanctions against all human operations in cooperative space. He called it barbarism. He called it savagery. He called it exactly the kind of behavior that proved humans were not ready to be members of any civilized structure. His voice built and rolled around the curved walls, and his delegation stood behind him in a solid line. Counselor Yeen raised one hand. Vor continued speaking. She raised her voice. Just once. And just enough. Ambassador Vor, sit down. It was not a request. The tone was not angry, it was not loud, but it had a quality to it that made it very clear that the words behind it had weight, and that the weight was not optional. Vor stopped speaking. He looked at her. Then he sat. Yin reached across her desk and pressed a single key on the control panel. Every screen in the Grand Assembly Hall lit up at once. The footage from Corridor 7 began to play. It was clear, and it was in full color. It was time-stamped in the corner of the frame, and it had full audio. Every being in the chamber watched a 9-year-old girl in an orange jacket walking through a crowded corridor. They watched her turn and bump into a leg. They watched Commander Dreth Vol look down at her. They watched his arm swing. They heard the sound. They watched her small body hit the wall. They watched the blood. They watched Vol straighten his jacket and walk away. They heard his soldiers laugh. The footage stopped. The silence that followed was how different from the silence before. The first silence had been shock. This one was something else. It sat in the room the way heavy things sit, pressing down. Yin let it sit for a full and deliberate moment. Then she spoke, and her voice was very quiet. And very clear. I will be recommending no charges against the 3 individuals present in this chamber today, she said. I will be recommending a full and immediate review of the diplomatic immunity clauses currently embedded in Article 14 of the Cooperative Scarn Accord. Effective from this session, those clauses are suspended pending that review. This session is now adjourned. Vor was on his feet again before she finished the last word. Other voices rose in the chamber, and several at once, sharp and overlapping. The Scaran delegation was standing as a block. Yin stood, collected the papers from her desk, and walked toward the chamber's side exit without slowing or looking back. Her aide fell into step beside her and kept up. Station security escorted Cole, Elena, and Yusuf from the chamber floor through a side corridor to a standard holding area. The officers who moved them said nothing beyond what was required. They were professional and correct in every way. One of them was a tall Flothari guard who had worked the station for over 20 years. As he held the holding room door open for Cole to pass through, he made brief eye contact and said nothing at all. But he held the door open with both hands, and he stood very straight. And then the look on his face was not the look of a guard escorting a prisoner. Cole nodded once and walked through the door. The Grand Assembly Hall continued behind them, loud with argument and competing voices. And as the most important room on Voss Station tried to figure out what had just happened and what the galaxy was supposed to do about it, by midday, the footage from Corridor 7 had reached every major galactic news network in operation. Every communications relay between Voss Station and the outer systems was carrying it. On stations and ships and settled planets across the known galaxy, beings of all kinds stopped what they were doing and watched a small girl hit a wall and bleed. And then watched 3 humans in a formal chamber set a container on a dais and say 7 sentences and step back. The reactions came fast, and they came from every direction. The Scarn Imperium released a formal statement within 2 hours of the council session ending. It was long and it was loud. It used the word barbarism 4 times and the word savage 3 times. It called for a full tribunal, a public apology from human leadership, and the immediate suspension of all human diplomatic credentials within cooperative space, and significant economic sanctions against human trade operations. It described what had happened as an unprovoked act of war against an Imperium officer serving under full diplomatic protection. It demanded that the cooperative act immediately and decisively. Several species aligned themselves with the Scarn position, mostly species with deep trade agreements and long-standing political relationships with the Imperium. Their statements were careful and measured and said mostly that the proper legal process needed to be followed and that unilateral action of any kind set a dangerous precedent. Their words were polite. They did not include the footage in their statements, but a very large number of species said nothing publicly at all. Their silence had its own meaning. Private messages began arriving at the Human Reach diplomatic office on Voss Station within hours of the session. Not formal communications. Not anything that would appear in official records. Personal messages, sent through quiet secondary channels, from ambassadors and senior counselors and career diplomats of species that had been navigating the Scarn Imperium's particular brand of arrogance for far longer than humanity had been traveling between stars. The messages were short and worded with great care so that nothing in them could be directly quoted in any proceeding. But their meaning, every single time. I was the same. We saw what happened in that corridor. We are glad that someone acted. We will not forget this. The Flothari Council sent a communication that was less quiet than the others. Counselor Yeen had signed it herself. It was 2 sentences long. It stated that the Flothari species considered the events of the previous night a natural and direct consequence of a long-standing systemic failure in cooperative law. It stated that the Flothari delegation would be formally supporting the full review of Article 14 and would be submitting their own recommended revisions within the month. Cole, Elena, and Yusuf remained in the holding area for 36 hours. The Human Reach legal team had begun preparing their defense before the 3 of them had even crossed the chamber floor on the morning of the session. The legal argument had been drafted in advance because humans were, among many other things, and exceptionally good at preparing for things they could see coming. The argument was straightforward and had several layers. Commander Voss had not been engaged in an official diplomatic function at the time of the incident, which complicated the immunity framing. The jurisdiction of the incident was non-Scaran, and the station authority had already formally declined to act, which closed the official channel on the record, and the response from the Cooperative Legal Office, as when it finally came, was that no standing framework covered the situation with enough clarity to bring a prosecution. On the second morning, that the holding room door opened. A cooperative legal officer stood in the doorway and told them they were free to go. The officer had the slightly stunned expression of someone who had been awake for 2 days, trying to find a law that applied and had not managed to find one. Cole said thank you. The officer nodded at the floor and stepped aside. Yusuf walked out and called his department supervisor to say he would be back for his afternoon shift. His supervisor said that was fine and that he should eat something first. Yusuf said he would try. Elena walked out, checked her datapad for messages, and went directly down to the freight docks to deal with a shipment that had been sitting unprocessed for 2 days and was starting to cause problems for 3 different contractors. She sent a message to Cole as she walked that said only, "Clean." He sent back, "Agreed." Cole walked to the station medical bay. Maya was sitting up on her cot when he came through the door. She was wearing a clean set of clothes, and her hair was back in 2 puffs. The bandage on her face was smaller now, not just covering the line of the cut itself. She was playing a word game on a datapad and eating something green and sticky out of a small foil packet that smelled intensely sweet. She looked like a child who had decided she had spent enough time being in a medical bay and was ready to be doing other things. Dr. Amara stood near the viewport. She had the look of someone who had not slept much, but was not going to mention it. When Cole came in, she looked at him. He looked back. A amount of time passed without either of them saying anything. Then she gave him a single nod. He returned it. That was all that needed to happen between them. Maya looked up from her datapad. "Are you the soldier from the corridor?" she asked. Cole said yes, he was. Maya studied him for a moment with the very serious, evaluating expression that children use when they are making a decision about someone. Then she gave a small nod of her own, as if she had confirmed something, and then went back to her word game. Amara sat down beside her daughter and looked out the viewport. The pale blue planet hung in the dark below the station, slow and steady in its long orbit, as it had been hanging there for hundreds of millions of years before any of them existed, and would go on hanging there long after all of them were gone. The light along its far edge was gold, where its sun was either rising or setting, and it was hard to tell which from up here. The news was still running on every screen in the station. Maya had noticed it. She did not look up from her game when she asked, "Mama, why are they showing our faces everywhere?" Amara thought about how to answer. She thought about the careful answer and the simple answer and the true answer. She thought about what a 9-year-old needed to understand, and what she could carry, and what she deserved to know. Because people learned something. Today, she said. Maya made a small sound that meant she was still mostly focused on her game, but was also listening. What did they learn? Amara looked at the planet below, at its slow and indifferent turn in the dark, at the thin gold line of light along its edge, where at the stars beyond it that went outward in every direction without any visible end. That when someone hurts a person who belongs to us, she said, we don't argue about it, we don't file a report and wait, we don't ask someone else to handle it, we take care of it ourselves and then we move on. Maya was quiet for a moment. She pressed something on her datapad. Then she said, "Oh," in the tone of someone who has received an answer that is smaller and cleaner than they expected, and then went back to her game. Cole stood by the door for a moment longer. There was nothing left that needed to be said. He turned and walked back out into the corridor and headed toward the docks where a transport was waiting to carry him back to his post. Out in the wider station, life was continuing. The corridors filled and emptied as they always did. Ships docked and departed. Traders moved goods from one place to another. Diplomats had meetings. Workers did their work. Children watched the observation deck windows with wide eyes. Beings of dozens of species went about the ordinary and necessary business of their days. But something had shifted in the space between all of it. It was not something that could be pointed to on a map or measured with any instrument. It lived in the small moments, in the adjustments that no one announced. It was in the way a Skarn checkpoint officer processed a human worker's documents without comment, and which he had never done before in the 3 years she had been passing that checkpoint. It was in the way a group of Glenish students moved to make room for a human family at a crowded food counter without being asked and without making a thing of it. It was in the way that when a young Theresi trader bumped into a human man in a busy corridor and looked up with genuinely wide and uncertain eyes, the human man smiled and said it was no problem at all and kept walking. The galaxy was very old. It had seen empires that called themselves permanent turn to dust. It had watched species that once controlled entire star systems slowly become footnotes. It was not the kind of place that changed quickly or easily, and it was not the kind of place that handed out lessons gently. But it did remember all of it. And across every species and every station and every quiet, dark corner of the space between stars, it remembered what it had seen and what it had heard, and it filed those things away in the deep and collective memory that old places build over time. It remembered what happened on Voss Station, in Corridor 7, on an ordinary afternoon, and for a very long time after, and in the quiet calculations that beings make when they are deciding how to behave and what they can afford to do, and what the cost of certain choices might be. The memory of that day was there, small, precise, and permanent, like a note left somewhere obvious, in handwriting that was impossible to misread.